My favourite day of the month is the last Friday of every month. I wake up, check my phone, look at my inbox, and right at the top of the inbox is the word payslip. And it's the same thing every month. I get really excited. I feel like a kid at Christmas opening his presents. But every time I check my payslip, I can't help but feel a little bit disappointed. And I am, of course, referring to the gut-punching feeling of seeing how much income tax you have to pay. But the thing is, I'm happy to do my bit and pay my fair share. But when I draw back the curtains and I see a road full of potholes, and if I want to make an appointment with the NHS and I'm told that I'm going to have to wait 5 months to see a doctor, I can't help but feeling, where is all this tax going? Why am I paying all this money and seeing nothing back? In this video, I'm going to be talking about why the UK economy has been failing and whether or not there is actually any light at the end of the tunnel for us Brits. First off, we need to understand how we actually got here in the first place. One of the main reasons the UK has been falling behind other G7 countries is because our national debt is significantly higher, particularly since the pandemic. In other words, we're having to borrow significantly more money just to get by. Basically, the government is skint. And the problem with the government that is heavily in debt is that the UK population are being shafted with higher taxes. In fact, the last time that tax revenue was this high was 80 years ago at the end of World War II, when we'd just been blitzed by the Germans and we were trying to physically rebuild the country from rubble. So the question is, why are we in so much debt? Well, one of the reasons I've mentioned already, and it was due to the increase in spending around the COVID pandemic. It's estimated that the government spent somewhere between 300 to 400 billion pounds on the pandemic. And this money was spent on things like furlough, so helping to pay people's wages, COVID, vaccination and testing centres, as well as the Tories spunking billions of pounds paying for unusable PPE from their mates' makeshift businesses. You absolute arse. And if that wasn't bad enough, shortly afterwards, this decided it would be a good idea to invade Ukraine. The problem here was that it didn't just affect Ukraine, it did affect the rest of the world too. In a nutshell, European countries imposed sanctions on Russia for starting a war with the idea of weakening their ability to fund the war. But then Russians turned around and said, wait a minute, you try to support Ukraine by making us pay sanction? If that's the way you want to play, I'm not going to sell you my oil and gas. This sent huge panic across the UK and the rest of Europe as there was an energy shortage, so energy prices shot up and people basically couldn't afford to heat their own homes. So once again, the UK government had to step in and help people subsidise their energy costs, which ended up costing another £44 billion. So these two once-in-a-lifetime crises put the UK government into an additional £400 billion worth of debt. And that figure alone was more money than the UK had borrowed over the last 5 years combined. And then, because everything was getting so expensive, the central banks tried to mitigate that by rising up interest rates. So now we're in this situation where we've got a load more debt, as well as interest rates that are 50 times higher than they were a couple of years ago. This has taken our average annual debt repayments from about £40 billion a year to around £100 billion a year. This means that all of the money that the UK would typically spend their money on, things like transport and schools and hospitals, building roads, emergency services, all of that money now has to be spent on paying off debt. And that's why public services are failing. That's why NHS waiting lists are at all-time highs. So the problem the UK government face now is, how do they get out of this debt trap without having to raise taxes, reduce public spending, or borrow more money? Well, on that first point, the UK government has actually raised taxes in the autumn budget, which I've enthusiastically covered in another video. But what we've been told is that taxes aren't going to rise again anytime soon. Believe what you will. Instead, one of the solutions is to increase productivity. Increasing productivity doesn't mean increasing working hours or just trying harder at your job, or that there's going to be some new legislation mandating that everyone in the workforce has to start a side hustle. It's more about increasing the output without increasing the input. So let's say you run a car factory and you currently produce 100 cars a week, but you want to be more productive, so you want to aim to make 120 cars per week. To do this without turning your factory into a Chinese sweatshop, you could streamline your business processes, upskill your staff, add more automation, and so on. And this means that with more productivity, you become more successful as a business, which is good for you, but also good for the economy. The problem that we're seeing though in the UK is that productivity has been pretty sluggish since the financial crash in 2008. One of the key drivers that really hit the brakes on productivity in the UK was Brexit. It meant that we had reduced access to EU markets, reduced exports, and a reduction in foreign investment. And this has just sucked money and business out of the UK faster than you can say vote leave. But whilst Brexit was our own fault, the UK wasn't the only economy to suffer from the effects of the pandemic or the restrictions to Russian energy. And whilst other countries have dusted themselves off and got back in the saddle, the UK is still lagging behind. The number of adults participating in work is declining in the UK. The main reason for this is that we have more people in the UK suffering from long-term illnesses. Part of this is because the UK has an ageing population, and as we know, coffin dodgers are more prone to illness. And part of it's because the NHS is on its arse and it's increasingly difficult to get access to healthcare. Another part of it is due to the increased cost of living, where it has knock-on effects on people, like not being able to afford to heat your own homes during the winter. Another side effect of having more people who have long-term sickness is that more people have to come out of the workforce to care for them. Having more old people in the population also means that there's a greater proportion of people that are retired, and we've also got more students as well as more people who just can't be f***ed to work. So the UK government now faces a pretty daunting challenge of trying to reduce their annual debt repayments so that money can actually be spent on the things that we pay tax for, as well as trying to get people into the workforce and increase productivity. But how does the UK government do that? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation really, because if there are more people who are sick, then you need better access to healthcare. But to have better access to healthcare, you need more public funding. And to have more public funding, you need more tax revenue. And with regards to students, the fact that the UK government has been trying to get more people to go to university in the first place is a triple whammy on national debt. Firstly, it means that there's significantly fewer people going into the workforce compared to 20 to 30 years ago. And when people do join the workforce, it's at a significantly later age. It also means that the government is forking out more and more money each year to pay for student loans, which puts them even further in debt. And thirdly, if the person who's received the student loans can't pay it off after 30 to 40 years, then the government writes it off. So they're probably going to lose money. And for the people who would rather be unemployed than join the workforce, you've got to give these people some incentives. Make them want to go to work. Make it easy to get work. Because at the moment, everything is so expensive. And the money that we do earn, we get taxed up to our eyeballs on. So can you really blame people who say, what's the point, and opt out of the workforce? Another way the UK government could improve productivity is by investing in more infrastructure. Things like transport and buildings and technology, as well as things like houses. Unfortunately, the UK's investment in its own infrastructure has been on a downward trend since the 1990s. This is a real problem because keeping hold of old infrastructure means that things are more likely to be able to break. And then you're spending that money on fixing old, outdated shit, instead of spending that money on modernised infrastructure, which is going to be more efficient, robust and productive. And one of the reasons that the UK is not investing in new infrastructure is because it's too expensive. The UK has some of the highest construction costs in the world. And secondly, there's so much red tape and rules and regulations about infrastructure projects. And it means that any small, tiny little problem can hold up a project for years. It's like an episode of Clarkson's Farm where anytime the farm wants to do something remotely productive, the council just fold their arms and say, no, go f*** yourself. And thirdly, the UK is incredibly London-centric. We've got people living and working in London, making decisions about where that money should go for the rest of the country. And that is undoubtedly going to lead to an unequal distribution of cash. I know a lot of what I've said in this video does make it feel as though the UK is a lost cause, but if the Labour government are able to turn things around and reduce their national debt and increase productivity and subsequently lower taxes and improve public services, I do think there is light at the end of the tunnel. To give you all a glimmer of hope, the UK economy is forecasted to grow over the next few years, albeit quite slowly. And the UK's recent productivity is no longer the worst in the G7. In fact, now we're about mid-table. So in answer to the question, is it too late for the UK to turn things around? The answer is no. I don't think we're categorically and unequivocally f***ed at this point. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.